All right, the Subcommittee on National Security will now come to order. I just want to offer as chair, I want to thank Dr. Padron and the folks at Miami-Dade College for hosting us here today. This is a great opportunity to be in the community and discuss issues that are important not only to this community but to the country. And you guys have done a lot of great things at Miami-Dade College, and so I salute your efforts. I'm also pleased to be joined today by some of my colleagues. Congresswoman Eliana Ross-Layton, who the U.S. Congress is going to be much poorer when she retires. She's had an illustrious career, always standing for freedom and justice here. Yeah, no, you've been phenomenal. We also have Senator Marco Rubio, who is Florida's preeminent national voice on human rights abroad, not only in Cuba, but in Venezuela, the people of Iran, and Marco Rubio is a leader nationally for us in terms of pursuing America's foreign policy interest around the world. Congressman Diaz-Balart, well-known freedom fighter here for people in Cuba, but also in places like the Middle East. He's the leader of an effort that I'm supporting of to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a foreign terrorist organization, which needs to be done. And so he's got a very broad portfolio in this area. And then Congressman Ted Yoho, he's this chairman of the Asia Pacific Subcommittee on the Foreign Affairs Committee, so he's engaged in those issues every day, but still very supportive of expanding freedom in Latin America, particularly in Cuba. So this is really a murderer's row in terms of freedom fighters here today. So you guys are lucky. You guys are lucky to have them here. The Obama administration eschewed policies designed to pressure and isolate the Castro regime in favor of a rapprochement with one of the world's most ruthless dictatorships, liberalizing restrictions on the Cuban regime while getting nothing for America in return. This sent an unmistakable message to America's enemies throughout the world that belligerence and defiance would be rewarded by appeasement and concessions. First, President Obama delisted Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, even though Cuba harbors members of designated terrorist organizations like the FARC and the ETA, as well as the notorious cop killer Joanne Chesimard, a member of the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. President Obama restored diplomatic relations with Cuba and reopened the American embassy in Havana without even a mention of Cuba's recalcitrant country status. And in return, our diplomats in Havana and their spouses have been subjected to repeated attacks while the Cuban government pleads ignorance. But it's ludicrous to think that the vast Cuban police state, which keeps U.S. diplomats under constant surveillance, does not know who is behind these attacks. The Obama administration also dismantled decades-old restrictions on trade and travel, pouring American dollars into the hands of the military, security, and intelligence services that oppress the Cuban people. The administration granted the Castro regime this gift without forcing it to pay a penny back towards the billions of dollars in property it stole from both Cuban exiles and U.S. citizens. President Obama even flew to Cuba for an official visit in March of 2016. Just hours before he touched down in Havana, the Cuban government arrested 50 protesters. Yet that didn't stop the president from meeting Raul Castro, taking in a baseball game with the Cuban dictator, while the nation's dissidents continued to rot in their jail cells. There was a clear roadmap to normalization in laws passed by bipartisan majorities in the Congress and signed by then-President Bill Clinton. And it's a stark contrast to the approach we saw under the Obama administration. The Cuban Democracy Act and the Helms-Burton Act specified meaningful conditions for normalization, such as holding free and fair elections, releasing all political prisoners, respecting basic human rights, and satisfactorily resolving property claims. And even President Obama seemed to understand this back in 2008 when he said, quote, "I will maintain the embargo. It provides us with the leverage to present the regime with a clear choice. If you take significant steps toward democracy, beginning with the freeing of all political prisoners, we will take steps to begin normalizing relations," unquote. Sadly, this turned out just to be another broken promise. And so despite these sweeping concessions to the Castro regime, political repression and human rights abuses remain widespread in Cuba. Cuba continues to hold numerous political prisoners and engages in thousands of short-term detentions a year in order to suppress dissent. Thankfully, we now have an administration that understands the folly of this approach. Last June, President Trump announced, effective immediately, quote, "I am canceling the last administration's completely one-sided deal with Cuba," and that he would, quote, "very strongly restrict American dollars flowing to the military, security, and intelligence services that are the core of the Castro regime." In November of 2017, the Trump administration announced new tighter regulations on travel and trade with Cuba. These are a good start, but much still needs to be done to fully implement the president's directive. The administration must cut off the flow of U.S. dollars to the Cuban government, continuing to add to the Cuba restricted list and restoring more pre-Obama restrictions on trade. The Trump administration also needs leaders who will faithfully implement the president's policies in key positions, like the Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs. President Trump made clear that the U.S. will now once again stand against the brutal repression of the Castro dictatorship and on the side of the Cuban people. But much more needs to be done to undo the damage done by the most recent policies. We need to ensure that the dream of libertad, freedom, for the Cuban people is not just an aspiration, but actually becomes a reality. And with that, I will recognize my fellow panelists for an opening statement if they have one.